Hello everyone, and welcome back to DeucesCracked.com. This is Andrew BalugaWhale Sideman back with another episode of Good Bluff, Bad Bluff, the series where we go through the basic theoretic underpinnings of what a bluff is, what makes a bluff good or bad, and how to think about different situations tied to bluffing. Now, we've kind of gone through a lot of the basic stuff so far, so we're kind of into well, you'll see today's episode is into a little bit more of the crazy, weird stuff. But we'll do a quick recap of what we have talked about. So I know it's been a while, but in the first few episodes we talked about the difference between classic bluffs and advanced bluffs, where a classic bluff is getting someone to just simply fold a better hand than you have. On the river might be a simple example. You have a missed flush draw, he has bottom pair. Can you get him to fold that? That would be a classic bluff. Whereas an advanced bluff encompasses a lot of other different things. Can I get my opponent to fold a hand that might even be worse than mine but make a mistake? Like, let's say, for example, if I have, medium pair and they have two overs and a backdoor straight draw, they probably have odds to continue, but they might not necessarily call. And so bluffing them in that case might be an advanced version of a bluff. There's a lot of different versions of this that we've talked about. Another thing that we've discussed over the course of previous videos is the necessity to balance more than one range in different spots. So kind of the most common version of this might be, let's say, floating the flop versus versus raising the flop. In general, we want to be able to have strong hands both in our flop raising range and in our flop calling range, which makes it somewhat challenging because we have to there's not that many good hands. We have to kind of be balancing in such a way that we're able to do some of both or some of either. And we see that this happens a lot. Pre-flop as well. Am I going to 3-bet bluff or am I going to flat and bluff on a later street? But we've talked about, obviously, in previous videos about whether or not it's a good idea to try to balance multiple ranges on the turn. Do I have a turn bluff raising range or not? Or do I have a turn floating range, or how's that going to work? And then on the river as well, am I going to be bluff shoving, bluff min raising, or not bluffing at all? Balancing sort of ranges in different spots can be a little bit tricky. Whether it's pre-flop or on later streets. Today we're going to talk a lot about some spots where we haven't really necessarily probably considered having more than one range. And there's obviously some spots that we just have written right off as like, I can't really ever bluff in those spots. But maybe you can, and today we'll talk about those. Another thing from a more recent episode is that bluffs can be slow played or fast played. There are some significant benefits to slow playing your bluff. I know it sounds a little bit weird to think about slow playing in terms of bluffs, but there are definitely some spots where if you have an aggressive opponent or you think that somebody is likely to fold stronger hands on later streets, where you can actually just go ahead and sort of delay your bluff until later streets to either induce more money out of your opponent before he folds, or to get a better sense of what your opponent's range is before you actually go ahead and do it. But then again, the downside to slow playing your bluffs are that your opponents will get to see more cheap cards. They might catch up and make a better hand, or worst case scenario, they might just go all in before you do, which makes bluffing kind of hard. And then the last thing that we've sort of have harped on over and over again in these videos is the importance of player type. And this is going to be another one that's really important today. But essentially, if you're trying to get someone to fold air, that works pretty well against bad players, but might not always work so well against like decent players. And the reverse is true when it comes to made hands, where against sort of non-thinking players, it's very difficult to get a non-thinking player to fold any kind of made hand that they've like actually hit on the flop or on the board somewhere. But for thinking players, it actually is somewhat more feasible to get them to fold some kind of a made hand if you can credibly demonstrate that you have a stronger range or more value hands than bluffs, or than the requisite number of bluffs in order to get your opponent to fold. Like, it is sort of possible. So we need to be considering player type a lot, especially when we talk about the things we're going to talk about today, and sort of be cognizant of who is capable of doing what. Because running a really fun, creative bluff against a guy who's not thinking isn't always going to work out all too well. Or against somebody who just hates your guts or something like that. I have a good friend that I play poker with a lot who, just like he and I are just not particularly inspired to fold against each other. It's kind of hard to get the other person to fold, even if you might represent very strong things. So player type matters a whole hell of a lot. As I'm sure you guys have been, gotten bored of me saying over and over and over again. Anyway, so let's talk about today. Today we are titling the Weird Bluffs episode. There are a lot of lines that we simply never take as a bluff, and the question that we're going to ask today is, should we? This is going to involve some areas that that not only have we not explored, but that poker players in general have not really explored. A lot of places that kind of are strange places to show up that, we can sort of ask ourselves, can we orchestrate this? Can we actually show up here on purpose? And then what are some lines that we might be able to consider that might be more attractive than the lines that we're used to defaulting towards? Sort of tied into this is going to be thinking about ranges versus ranges, and sort of one sort of piece of discussion here is, are blockers sort of good enough on their own to run a creative bluff? Like, let's say that you have a hand that blocks the nut flush, but it's not super likely that you actually have the nut flush. Is the blocker enough to actually run a weird bluff like that? And then kind of when you get to a spot with a strange hand, sort of a hand that's sort of unusual for you to get to that spot with that, does that mean that you should be bluffing in those spots? Is that an inclination to bluff or an inclination away from bluffing? We'll talk about those things. We'll also go through kind of 3 different sections of very weird lines to take as bluffs. And we'll sort of make sure that we go through them one at a time so that we can grasp all of them. So it should be a fun episode today. As usual, we will start today's session by talking about the history of this type of bluff. This has become a theme. I hope you guys have seen. I like history a lot. Basically, a lot of bluffs that we now consider to be somewhat normal started off being considered very, very crazy and unusual. So I've listed a few of these examples, but even something as simple as min raising pre-flop was seen as like a crazy, fishy, terrible thing to do until people realized it was really good. Nobody really did things like a cold 4-bet bluff. That was totally crazy until it started. Somebody made an argument. The worst player on 2+2 made an argument that was pretty compelling, and then everyone was like, "Oh, okay." And this seems like it might be good. Same thing happened with the click it back, which I think was Aaron Jones once upon a time, who was like, "Yeah, well, if they 3-bet you, you could, or if you 4-bet them." Or sorry, if they 4-bet you, you could always just like click it back and get a pretty good price. So that was something that nobody ever did. It was super crazy. I remember, back before anyone had any conception of the suicide bluff, which is something we talked about in the last video, which is, okay, it's on the river and your opponent has put in almost all of his chips without very many left. And obviously he's representing having no fold equity. Can you get someone to fold in a spot where they have sort of no fold equity? And if so, then, or you have no fold equity. If so, like the price you get on that very small extra amount of money is pretty insane. You could essentially win a stack, without even having to make a hand. It's a pretty good thing to do. So a lot of these things started off as just being totally insane. No one would ever do them. And now they've sort of become wrapped up into the lexicon of a good poker player. But there's a number of things still that are sort of somewhere between kind of crazy and totally insane. Some of the ones that are kind of crazy that you see sometimes are like overbetting, especially overbetting the river. You see that some decent portion of the time. Excuse me. There's donk leading, so that would be like you call pre-flop and then lead into the pre-flop raiser on the flop. You don't see it too often, but you see it sometimes. The stop and go, even maybe a little bit more rare, but not really seen as that crazy, where you check call the flop and then donk the turn. Or even bet call the flop and then donk the turn. Both be considered stop and goes. I think that the check call donk is like the mini stop and go. And then some of these like bluff ideas are really crazy even today. Going for 3 check raises. Obviously, if you do the limp re-raise and the 3 check raises, you've played the greatest hand of all time and you win poker. But even things like check call, check raise, limp re-raising pre-flop, donking as an overbet. These are things that like nobody ever really does. And today we'll sort of wonder whether or not those are actually things that are reasonable ideas and maybe not as insane, or maybe we can find an edge here or some kind of advanced, strategy or tech that nobody else is really doing yet. So we're going to investigate that a little bit today. But yeah, it's funny if you go back through the history of poker, you'll see that these min raise, click it back, suicide bluff, these were things that nobody ever even did. Once upon a time, even three betting as a bluff was considered really crazy. Like, if you had jacks and someone three bet you, you're like, oh well, I've got to fold because they just have aces or kings. Maybe even I would fold queens because like they three bet. Obviously, the world's changed a lot, but the world's still changing. That's kind of why we're doing these types of videos. When I'm sure you guys have all been in this situation, and it sort of marks one of those crazy, weird bluffs when you say one of these things. So, something like, how can you possibly be bluffing here? These are things that these are just like quotes about me when I play poker sometimes. Like, I have no idea what the fuck you can possibly have. How could you possibly have anything good here? Or how could you even possibly like decide this is a good time to bluff? And then last, sort of whoever does this kind of thing as a bluff. So these are actually, when you make your opponent say things like this, these are actually kind of good spots to be bluffing. And so you could imagine there are a number of types of hands that you play where when you when you make, like, let's say a value raise or something like that, maybe it's a river raise, or maybe it's, maybe you like check called flop and check called turn and then made a flush on the river and then decide, and then check raise the river or something along those lines. Are you ever bluffing in a spot like that? Because you really might never be bluffing in a spot like that, which actually might turn what would normally be a very, very profitable opportunity into one that might even be a negative free roll against yourself. You could imagine, for example, if you had a hand like, say, 10-9 suited and you called on the button, a guy raised, you called on the button, and the flop came down, Queen 10-4 with two spades, giving you a flush draw, giving you, let's say, just paired a backdoor flush draw, one spade. He bets, you call. The turn card is a deuce of spades. He bets, you call. The river card is the six of spades, giving you a flush, and he bets, and you get excited about raising all in for value. Now, against a weaker player, this is obviously totally fine. They'll still pay you off with lots of things, but if you are playing against a really strong thinking player, he might just say, like, what bluffs do you ever actually have that you raise the river all in against my river bet? And you might actually only get money in there against people that have better flushes than you, which turns what should be kind of an ordinarily profitable opportunity into one where you're very unbalanced and you're getting exploited or manipulated by a very good player. So being able to sort of have some of these bluffs in your range that are so-called crazy, not only does it have great image effects, we'll talk about in a bit, but it makes it kind of difficult for your opponents to actually ever play too well against you. It's kind of hard when someone's like, well, you just can never be bluffing here, but I'm still going to, and I'm a good player, then it's pretty hard for them to end up making those types of big calls that, are, sort of highly exploitative against us. So, before we dive into some of these bluffs, there are some reasons why these bluffs are considered crazy and why they generally haven't kind of made the cut as being top level bluffs for kind of as part of the normal person's poker game. So the biggest reasons why these bluffs are not that great in general, at least to start off with, is they usually involve putting a lot of money in the pot from out of positions. This is especially like things like donking lines and stuff like that. They usually often mean that you're not representing a whole lot of value hands when you play a hand that way. And so it's kind of easy for you to have sort of a range your opponent could say, well, he's just bluffing too often. We'll talk about some of these spots, but this is sort of really common when like a flush draw misses on the river and you're like, I'm going to donk bluff on the river when the flush draw misses. Well, no one ever really believes that that's anything other than a missed flush draw. And sort of along the same lines, like your opponent will oftentimes just say like, well, I have no idea how you could possibly have the nuts here, because this is like a really strange way for you to play this hand. So I'm confused enough that I'll just pay it off and see whatever you had. That happens a fair amount with these types of crazy bluffs. And then often these types of bluffs tend to offer like pretty good pot odds to your opponent. So if you're, let's say, donking the flop and your opponent is like in position with a couple of overs, they generally have pretty good pot odds to continue against a range that they're not really sure about. And then certainly for things like suicide bluffs, you're obviously giving your opponent pretty great pot odds in those type of situations as well to just pay off and see what you have. So This is kind of my disclaimer at the beginning of the video, that there are definitely some reasons why these are a little bit harder to maintain in your range than something as simple as, like, let's say a flop raise or a flop float, which are kind of sort of the most common versions of bluffing, or a pre-flop 3-bet or something like that, which don't involve putting in all that much money, where you actually can represent kind of a large number of value hands. Your opponent's not really that confused about what you're doing. The story you're telling is pretty generally consistent, and the pot odds are okay, but not that great. Now, the other side of that coin is that your opponent kind of knows what you have and plays pretty well. So sometimes a little bit of the crazy can actually do some good things for you. Okay, moving onward. So these are the kind of lines that we're going to look at today. I've kind of broken them out into 3 groups: overbetting, sandbagging, and donking. The overbets are so we'll describe them quickly. So a classic overbet is end of the hand, on the river. You've decided to go for full polarization, represent the nuts or nothing. I mean, obviously you could merge an overbet, certainly. But in general here, this is like the classic version is, I got either a bluff or I've got the nuts, and I'm going to bet really, really big, more than the pot on the river, is sort of the classic version. Now, the sort of modern one, which you don't see too often, but I think is actually like pretty sexy and has some major implications, would be betting more than the pot on the flop or the turn. This would mean something along the lines of betting, let's say, 1.2x pot or even 1.5x pot on the flop as a c-bet, instead of your normal half to 2/3 type of pot bet. That has some major implications about what your opponent can sort of do with this range. And then the retro overbet would be betting like very, very large pre-flop. I call this the retro overbet because, back in the day, everyone raised a 3.5x, the big blind, which was the same thing as a pot size raise. So while I think that those things are kind of cute and have like a lot of image effects, there could definitely be some arguments in favor of doing them. Like, let's say, for example, let's say that you're playing in a mid to high stakes game and your opponents are really familiar with how to deal with, let's say, a cutoff min raise, when they're playing in the big blind. It might make them quite confused to make it even 3x or even 4x, and just play a tighter range but still balance. You might be able to generate some mistakes doing things like that as well. So, like if your opponent, let's say, decides he's going to fold, the top 80, or sorry, up down to the top 15 or 10% of hands, if you make it 3.5 or 4x pre-flop, then there could be some major benefits into doing that and having your opponent just fold a lot. The sandbag would often be known as just the sort of normal, almost like a fishy out of position slow play, like the way like fish, let's say if you flop a set from the blinds, will often check call flop and check raise the turn. This is sort of a difficult bluff line to pull off because you have to have usually something to check call the flop with. Usually this is best served with some type of backdoor draw, some kind of disguised large draw, like let's say king queen on a Jack 10 4 board might be an interesting place to check call. I think we had a ghost video where I played against someone who actually did that and then totally crushed me by double check raising when they hit the nuts on the turn. I was extremely confused. When else would you... Oh yeah, it might be something also would be good if you had, let's say, like a pair and a backdoor, like middle pair and a backdoor flush draw on the flop, and then the turn card maybe bricks out. Might be a good spot to just try to represent a very strong hand with that sort of sandbag line. The ultra sandbag would be waiting one more street and trying to get there on the river. And then the so-called retro sandbag, or trying to like make that move on the river. So let's say the same kind of deal. You check call flop and you miss the turn. Let's say the turn is just total rainbow blank and you check call again. If the river card brought, let's say, some good scare cards for your range, it might be a good idea to try to do the ultra sandbag and check raise the river. This is sort of along the lines of the things that we talked about in the last video. And then the retro sandbag would be, again, a total throwback line. If you're in a really splashy game with lots of people who are playing, who are raising lots and lots of things, going for a limp re-raise is actually, like, I think maybe possibly could come back in style as a bluff. partially because nobody will ever really think that people limp re-raise anything other than nut hands. And so if you're in the type of game where if you limp, you're likely to get, a raise, maybe a 3-bet, some calls, things like that, you might be able to effectively cold 4-bet sort of in a spot that no one will think you're bluffing if you incorporate limping into your range, which, again, this is one of those things that I've talked in many videos in the past about limping the button. There's nothing inherently wrong about limping, but these are sort of, again, crazy bluff lines that you wouldn't think that people should do, but maybe we should. The last set of lines that I want to talk about are donking related lines. So a normal donk would be leading into the pre-flop raiser. A stop and go might be, or mini stop and go, I should say, is check calling the flop and then leading the turn. And then the ultra stop and go would be check calling the flop, check calling the turn, and then leading the river anyway. And we'll talk about why some of these lines might actually be good or bad in a moment. So let's first go through the overbets. So essentially, overbetting reduces the pot odds your opponent gets, and it represents polarization. But there's actually some really interesting stuff you can find on old 2+2 threads, I think, about how overbetting actually can make your opponent theoretically want to call more often, which is to say that, like, if you're overbetting, you can actually have a few more bluffs in your range, because you make a lot of money when you actually have a good hand and get called. So even though you give your opponent some worse pot odds, it may not always necessarily result in more folds, but anyway, it probably should against the average opponent. It should result in more folds. And it certainly represents you being a sort of a nuts or nothing kind of situation. But sort of at the end of the day, overbetting the river creates a pretty simple math problem that's going to kind of depend on how many combinations your opponent thinks that you would ever do this with as a bluff. Now, in some situations, especially on like anonymous tables, some of my students have had a lot of success overbet bluffing on anonymous tables, because people just like don't learn enough that you're capable of running this kind of thing as a bluff, because not that many players actually are ever overbetting the river as a bluff. So sort of in terms of image and environment, you might be able to get away with sort of saying that overbetting the river as a bluff can actually be really effective against a thinking player, or someone who at least appears to be a thinking player. But if you want to take this to sort of its inevitable next step, you might say, well, overbetting earlier streets sort of add a massive degree of extra complexity to this. So let's say, as an example, that you raise on the button and your opponent calls in the big blind, and both of you have super wide ranges. And let's say your opponent has something like ace-8, which is a hand we'll come back to later on today. And let's say the board comes down king-6-3, rainbow. This is a spot normally where ace-8 is usually a fine spot to call against an opponent who c-bets a lot, because they're just c-betting on an 8-6-3 board, lots of 9-8s and 9-7s and 8-7s and ace-deuces and 5-9s and 10-4s and all these things, right? But the problem, suddenly a problem gets to develop when your opponent fires out a overbet on the flop, because suddenly the range they're playing against tilts a little bit away from a lot of these air hands, at least like in theory it could, and sort of tilts a little bit more to some of those larger hands, and the reverse implied odds of something like ace-8 start to become more significant, where, like, if they're paying off a half pot bet when you have, let's say, pocket aces, that's not so bad for them. Against their range in general, that's fine. But if they're going to pay off a 1.5 pot bet and then maybe another really big turn bet, which is likely to come after you overbet the flop, then all of a sudden their whole strategy of, let's say, defending really, really wide pre-flop and then defending really wide on the flop starts to have some major concerns when they're like essentially facing much larger bets on later streets. This is something fun you can do in no limit. You can't do in limit games or pot limit games. So in theory, your opponent should be folding something like ace-8 more often to a larger flop c-bet, but whether or not they will is another question. Now, obviously, if your opponent is not folding to, let's say, a 1.5 pot c-bet with a large portion of his range, you should probably start adopting some of these overbetting for value strategies. But you should be able to have this as an option in your bluffing range especially if your opponents are the kind of people who are going to be like relatively sticky, but are sort of only sticky in a context they understand. If you push them outside of that context with a large, like a big C bet or a very large turn bet or something like a 1.2 or even 1.5x turn bet, it becomes very, very difficult for your opponent to actually have any experience or practice against that type of strategy. And so this is something that like is tied to price sensitivity. Now, traditional price sensitivity against weaker players doesn't really exist. Like, weaker players tend to just not care how big you make it and be much more inclined to just call if they have a hand and fold if they don't. But thinking players are price sensitive. They will sort of think about what your bets represent and what it's likely to happen, what's likely to happen on later streets with bet sizings and stuff like that. And so this is a concept that we're not super strong on yet of how people's price sensitivity might affect us or what line we want to take. In theory, like there could be lots of situations where the correct balanced bluff line, if we're going to balance multiple ranges, might include overbetting the flop or the turn. And again, you're under no obligation to overbet later streets. You could imagine how confusing and difficult it could be to play against somebody who bets 1.5x pot on the flop, 1.2x pot on the turn, and then a quarter pot on the river. Could be very, very challenging. It's sort of the reverse of what you normally see, which is a half pot on the flop, 3/4 pot on the turn, and then a big river bet. You could, that sort of half pot, 2/3 pot, full pot type of situation is really designed against, bad passive players or weaker players who are likely to, once they show you they've made a hand, they're unlikely to fold it on later streets. Whereas good players tend to be kind of somewhat of the opposite, which is they tend to not fold a lot on earlier streets, but then they might fold more on later streets. So you could imagine that there's some merit to at least thinking about how price sensitivity has changed the way we should structure our bet sizes in terms of overbetting. Anyway, let's move on to our next set of crazy bluffs to talk about. These are called sandbagging, which is kind of fun. Sandbagging, for those of you who are non-American, is a very old school terminology for like slow playing. Anyway, so a similar problem with these sort of type of crazy bluffs, as I denoted at the very beginning, is that when you try to do like a bluff in a weird spot, you are always going to be representing polarization because your opponents are not ever going to think you're going to have that many type of different value hands to do it like that. But you'll also sort of, you won't imagine that you would actually have a very high bluff frequency in many of these situations as well. So actually, believe it or not, checking to the preflop raiser on the flop is a slow play. I mean, you are sandbagging. You are trapping someone into putting a C-bet out there. You could imagine that, let's say if you're playing in a tournament with an 18 big blind stack, if you flat preflop with aces, you're slow playing them just, to get them to put in a C-bet. One C-bet against you is a huge, amount of value. And so, even in a deep stack game, if you have let's say if you flop a set, we often just check to the preflop raiser to induce action. Or if we flop a flush draw, we check to the preflop raiser in order to try to check raise and steal that extra bet that they put in. So in that sense, it's very reasonable to slow play or sandbag against somebody by checking to them on the flop. But what about checking to them on the turn or the river to induce extra action? Now, for all of you guys playing in smaller stakes games, this is probably not going to be extremely applicable. Because just in general, most players are not going to be betting the turn or the river very often with hands that they're likely to fold. That means either bluffs or thin value bets. And if they are thin value betting, they're not that likely to fold them. And generally in passive games, they're obviously not bluffing very much. So, you kind of, in order to sandbag or take a creative, let's say check call, check raise turn, or a check call, donk river, or a check call, check raise river, which would be kind of some classic sandbagging lines, you kind of need to expect your opponent to be extremely aggressive in lots of spots. So this line is actually pretty effective in tournaments where people are kind of crazy. And it's very effective in higher stakes cash games where people are going to be bluffing a really high portion of the time. At least especially in high stakes online cash games. But you are giving up kind of a lot in order to make these types of lines work, in the sense that you're giving up relatively cheap extra cards. You're giving your opponent a chance to make equity or to sort of catch up. You're also giving your opponent that sort of dangerous ability to either go all in before you do, which is problematic if you're trying to bluff, or you give them the opportunity to just check back the river, which could be a really big problem if your line is, let's say, to take a hand like, say, again, let's do 10-9 suited, and let's say the board comes down something like Queen 8-3 with the backdoor flush draw. You have a gutter and backdoor flush draw. If you decide to go check call on the flop, and then the turn card was, let's say, a 7, and you check and your opponent bets again, you decide to check call, planning on check raising all in any river. And then if the river card is like a deuce and you check and he checks back with, King 5, it's like a little bit sad or problematic. So you need your opponent to be extremely aggressive in order to sort of reap the benefit of these types of bluff lines. So in general, we often find that sandbagging is actually probably not usually your best bluff line. In the sense that your opponent is just sort of too likely to either make a better hand or make a hand they won't fold, go all in first, or check back. So that's why we usually end up check raising the flop instead of check calling. But in some aggressive games, this actually is a preferable bluff line. And actually, one thing I've been sort of laughing about to myself recently is that I think that in some of the like mid-stakes online games that have become extremely, extremely aggressive pre-flop with lots of raising and 3-betting, you might be able to justify limp free raising with a balanced range and including some bluffs in like that. But again, the downside of that is that your opponents will see a lot of flops, and you won't be able to sort of capitalize on getting people to fold stuff. Also, a big issue of stealing the blinds and getting raked on later or not stealing the blinds and getting raked on the flop is an issue. Also, like let's say if you have a hand like Ace 10 suited and you decide to limp it, maybe Ace 10 is not a great example. Let's say Jack 10 suited, you decide to limp it, and or Ace 5 suited or something like that, and you're planning on pulling out this cool limp re-raise, and then just like one guy limps behind, the big blind checks, like that becomes a relatively large problem for you. Again, not an insurmountable problem. You have a great hand, you're going to be playing just fine, but it's a spot where you're going to get raked, and your opponents are going to see equity with hands like, say, Queen 4 offsuit that you would have rather had them fold before the flop. Assuming that they're in the big blind. I don't think it's super likely that someone will limp behind in an aggressive game with Queen 4 offsuit, but they'd certainly check the big blind. So anyway, I think in general, like this type of super passive line to induce a bunch of aggression is only good in the most aggressive of games, tournaments and mid to high stakes cash games. Donking is the last one of these sort of groups of interesting lines that we should be thinking about. So donking in general is about being aggressive when someone else is supposed to be aggressive. When someone else is supposed to be strong, you kind of swoop in and steal the initiative, and people are always like, what are you doing? Like, if I raise pre-flop, I'm representing a strong hand in theory, and you're calling representing a weaker hand in theory, and I'm supposed to c-bet all the time in theory, and so why are you betting? Because if you have a good hand, you should probably just wait for me to bet. If you have a bad hand, you should either fold, or you should wait for me to bet and bluff. But either way, you should wait for me to bet, so why are you betting? So the old thinking is kind of what I just described. So the old thinking is you raise pre-flop and I call. You should have a better hand than I do. Right? Makes sense. Like you have aces and I can't. But in the new world, if you raise pre-flop and I called, especially if you're talking about like a button raise, I should be stronger than you because you're raising just total garbage all the time. And even though you can have aces in your range, aces is a pretty small portion of that range relative to all like the other random crap that you have. And so I actually should be stronger than you. So the old thinking was, as the pre-flop raiser, I will c-bet everything. And the new thinking is like, I missed. I will not c-bet anything. That's an exaggeration, but people aren't c-betting nearly as often as they used to because they're sort of recognize that they're not representing strength anymore by just hitting the bet button over and over again. So if that's the case, we'll sort of continue talking about donking here a little bit more because donking is kind of one of the larger ones. If your opponents are not c-betting, then donking on the flop suddenly becomes very reasonable. In a sense, you have sort of seized the better range. You have a superior range to theirs. You are not reaping a lot of extra money from c-bets because your opponent isn't c-betting all that often. And so you can actually go ahead and make your opponent fold even some better hands, but certainly some hands with equity, sort of in that advanced bluff vibe. So you could actually make some really good arguments for donking flops in today's game, for sure, as a bluff. And then by the same token, you could extend this to later streets and say that If your opponent doesn't double barrel, once you've called the flop, you have a stronger range than your opponent's wide c-betting range. So if your opponent's not likely to double barrel, you could essentially bet on the turn saying that my range looks better than your range does. And by the same token, you could do the same thing on the river. Now, I've noted each time that if your opponent doesn't double or triple barrel, these things are good. But if your opponent is likely to put a lot of money in the pot with weaker hands via double barrel or triple barrel bluffing, then we often tend to prefer those sandbagging type of lines that we talked about a moment ago. Now, the problem with the check call flop, check call turn, donk river line is that it usually doesn't work. Even though in theory it should be very strong, you should have like a pretty strong hand to call 2 streets and then want to put in a big bet on the river. It doesn't usually work because your opponents tend to either do one of two things. They tend to either see a misdraw of some kind and be like, okay, well, you clearly have a misdraw here, and call. Or they tend to just refuse to believe that you would take this line with a value hand. And so even though like a lot of you know, you probably are, a lot of you out there probably know that you pay off in this spot where, like, let's say that you flop top set and someone, like a fishy player, check calls, and the turn card, it brings a flush draw and he check calls, and the river card completes the flush and he like pots it. You all know that like he's representing a flush, that he has a flush, but you still end up calling anyway. So this is one of those spots where I actually think that there's a sort of a future realm where if our opponents are smart enough, this would be pretty good. But I think in a lot of cases, this sort of like this extended donking is not always so good. But these earlier ones can be very, very reasonable in the sort of modern game dynamic. So I want to take a hand to talk about today about what happens when you show up with a very strange hand. And I want to take it from watching. I was sweating my friend Emil Patel, White Line, the classic DeucesCracked and 2+2 legend, who is just a monster poker player. In fact, you can find an old video series of Emil and I doing sweating each other and like talking about what we think is correct and disagreeing about everything. But I wonder what I forget that series is even called. I don't even remember. It was a good series though. Anyway, Emil was playing heads up for $1.3 million yesterday when, or I guess, probably not yesterday when this comes out, but a little bit ago in I think the Scoop 10K Championship, I believe, and he ended up finishing second, sadly. But he had a hand when he was heads up on the final table that was exactly this thing. Emil raises on the button, and you call in the big blind with ace, spade, 8 clubs. And the board comes down king of clubs, queen of clubs, 3 of spades, and you check, and Emil c-bets, and you call. And in this case, you're calling here basically because you think you have the best hand a lot. You're getting pretty good pot odds with this sort of giant pot. You have in this case, you actually have a chip advantage, so sort of tournament stuff is at play as well. And you also like have some okay backdoors, backdoor straight draws, and backdoor 8-high flush. Or sorry, you have a 2 backdoor. We have a backdoor 8-high flush draw, and you also have like the blocker to any kind of significant spades, which, as you'll see, will be important. The turn is the 8 of spades, so you make a pair and sort of a blocker to the backdoor nut flush draw, and he bets again. I should say he just bets, but he bets again, and you decide to call. Again, raising the turn here would represent a lot of draws, so you're probably not likely to be able to bluff very effectively Emil off of a king or anything like that. And then the river card is the 6 of spades, completing this. Now, this is a very strange spot for the villain to show up with the ace of spades in his hand. With just the lone ace of spades in his hand. There's sort of, obviously there's this collection of ace X offsuit hands, but really he should probably only be continuing with ace X with a club in it, just for the extra equity is nice and potential blockers. He'd also continue with something like ace 10 or ace jack, but he also would be relatively likely to 3-bet those hands pre-flop. So it's really hard for you to have anything when you get to this river. If you were to check raise, it's really hard for you to ever have the hand that you actually have. There's just not very many combinations of these types of hands. Whereas you can have lots of different combinations of, let's say, ace X of spades would certainly have flatted like flop and turn. And obviously certainly things like king X or queen X of spades as well that make flushes. So in this particular spot, we have blockers, which we'll talk about in a second, but we also have showed up with a hand that, like, we don't actually have very many of these types of hands. So when you show up in a spot like this that has blockers, that the board has gotten scary, you want to say to yourself, well, do I ever really bluff in this spot very often? And if you're not taking a hand like, let's say, ace-7 of clubs, which would probably be a pretty bad hand to check raise here on the river as a bluff, because you're kind of you don't really block anything. Your opponent has lots of combos of the nuts, and also had many fewer combos of bluffs, on earlier streets. Whereas in this case, Emil has lots of combinations of, ace-x of clubs here that he could have been bluffing the flop and the turn with. So in this sense, this is a pretty great spot to try to move somebody off of a king on the river if they decide to bet. And certainly, it's a spot where you have like a hand that you sort of wouldn't show up with a bluff very often in this type of situation. So in that sense, this is about the best bluff hand we can have. So when you show up with a strange hand like this, I want you to be conscious of it and say, I showed up in a spot where I don't bluff with a great hand to bluff. I should probably pull the trigger. And I think in this case, had Emil bet, this would have been a check raise. But Emil decided to check back with, I don't actually know what he had. Something that was worse than a pair of eights, though. And then blockers are kind of the other elements of these kind of crazy, weird bluffs. So you can imagine that when your opponent's being aggressive in general, that a blocker is essentially damaging to their range. So if your opponent, let's say, had Emil bet that last street and bet the ace of, or bet like on the rivered spade, the fact that you have the ace of spades means that he cannot have this huge section of his range that he's representing, which are essentially all of any ace-x of spades for the nuts. He simply just can't have those things, which means that his value range is essentially gutted on the river. Now, there obviously are like a lot of other things you can have, but that's a big section of things that he simply cannot have now. So he doesn't know that you have that, so he thinks that he can still represent that. So that's pretty problematic for him. And a lot of PLO players are pretty familiar with this. We'll talk about PLO in just a second. But when your opponent is three-barreling with, like, let's say, a polarized range, or so anytime your opponent is putting in one of these types of big bets, like whether it's a pre-flop 4-bet or a polarized, or a three-barrel or a river check raise, something like that, they're always representing a very polarized range. And so you can actually out-represent them in the polarized range game when you have a lot of blockers. Actually, I wasn't thinking I was going to talk about this, but we can bring it up. The way Emil busted the main in second place, he had raised the button with Jack 10. His opponent had called in the big blind. The flop had come down Queen 10-9. Went check. Emil bet, and the other guy called. The turn card was a queen. It went check and check. And the river card was a jack, making the board Queen 10-9, Queen Jack, putting a 4 straight out there with a paired board. And Emil has Jack 10. The other player bet about 3/4, almost pot actually. And Emil decided to go all in as a bluff. Now, the truth is that it's a weird line for Emil to ever have a really big value hand, right? He probably would bet a hand like 3 queens on the turn if he had something like Queen Jack or something like that, or Queen 10 for a full house. He would also probably bet something like, really you bet any trips or full house on the turn you would expect. But you would also not really expect him to run too many bluffs for his tournament life on that river, because his opponent in theory could have all of the combinations of full houses as well, all of the Queen Jacks and Queen 10s, stuff like that. But when Emil has Jack 10 on that board, it becomes much more difficult for his opponent to have any of those really nut value hands that his opponent is representing. And in fact, when his opponent bets like so large on the river, he basically almost always has a single king for kind of the medium straight, or he has a total bluff, in which case Emil can fold his opponent off of the hand. Actually, wait, hold on a second. I think I might have got the board wrong. Man, that must have been it. Yeah, that must have been it. Or he can get his opponent to fold, maybe even like a low straight, like an 8 or something like that. There's lots of things his opponent might theoretically thin value bet here, or be bluffing with, that Emil can get the guy to fold. So Emil basically says, well, I can out-represent the nuts relative to what you can do. So I'm going to go for it. And that was actually, I think, was a pretty good spot to bluff. It's unfortunate his opponent had a very cleverly played pocket queens for top quads, which is just going to do it to you if that's what happens. But the general rule that you can take from PLO experience is not to overdo blockers. If your opponent is conscious of the fact that you might be raising with a lot of blockers, just don't do it all the time. Try to do it in spots where you can credibly represent really good hands and not necessarily just blockers. Even that, though, doesn't always work. Okay, so to summarize sort of what we talked about today, great bluffs will do the following things. You'll credibly represent significant value combinations, which basically means that you don't have to have as many value combinations as bluffs. You just have to have enough value combinations to make your opponent think he's getting a bad deal. You generally want to go after ranges that are weak. This is the so-called capped range philosophy. I'm not a huge subscriber to capped ranges because I think that your opponents will make their choice not necessarily because of how capped their range is or how weak their absolute strength is. There's lots of situations where my range might be capped and yet I would still be like, it's the top of my range and I have to call something, so I will call. But in general, attacking ranges that are weak is sort of better for bluffs. Providing poor odds to continue is good. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that you are giving your opponent that you're betting huge all the time. It just means that you're betting big enough that your opponent, relative to what your kind of range looks like. So if you never have bluffs and you bet like a quarter of the pot, your opponent may find a lot of folds, which could give you great odds, poor odds for your opponent to continue and great odds for you to bluff, even if you're betting a really small amount. Number 4 is really significant. We're talking about targeting a player who's only capable of thinking relatively. This is especially significant for today's video. Taking strange bluff lines only works against people who are thinking quite deeply about the game, and pretty much nobody else. And then lastly, leveraging your stack size for the maximum impact with the minimum risk. Things like the click it back line, like a turn min raise, like a flop donk bet, like a small 4-bet pre-flop. These are all things that can sort of leverage your stack sizes in such a way that you're risking the least while accomplishing the most. Again, these are sort of general vague platitudes, but they're important to discuss. And the last slide for today is talking about the game theory application of sort of taking these crazy types of lines. So the best players in general are always sort of capable of having both good hands and bluffs, sort of no matter what line they take. And sort of at lower stakes games against weaker players, it's more okay to have sort of a predictable game because no one's really paying too much attention, and they're unlikely to make kind of elite decisions. But even now at mid stakes, people have started to become quite good, and have sort of been able to balance and come up with what you might call a relatively predictable, balanced playing style, which is to say I raise these hands, I c-bet these hands, I defend these hands, so on and so forth. But truly balanced play involves balancing instead of multiple ranges, which is obviously very difficult to do, but also has sort of a big benefit, as we talked about a second ago, in that it confuses your opponents tremendously. It's, again, if it's balanced, it's still not exploitable, and it causes your opponents to remember you and sort of be really confused about what your range is doing in general. So, for example, if you pull off even one limp re-raise, your opponents are going to just have no idea what the hell is going on, whether or not you're a fish or a regular, what you're doing. And even if people know you're not a fish, they still won't really know what the hell's going on. And you can see even elite players like Scott Seaver sometimes will limp a balanced range from early position just because it makes his opponents really confused about what the hell's going on. It's kind of people aren't that likely to play well against your sort of balanced range if they don't have any experience against it and they're kind of not really sure what you're going for. So essentially, game theory at its root should encourage you to try a lot of different lines and sort of incorporate the best of them at the best times into your balanced strategy. I don't know if you guys have ever seen the ice cream stand video about game theory, but the basic idea is game theory optimal solutions or Nash equilibriums show up when people are essentially moving and counter-moving and counter-moving and counter-moving until they end up kind of in one spot where neither person has any moves left to do anything different. Now, in sort of a game like rock, paper, scissors, that is not that complicated to get to, but in Texas Hold'em, there are so many options, no limit especially, so many options that you can experiment with that you really should never get, for now at least, stuck into a sort of a limited way of thinking about bluffing. So can I only bluff with c-bets or flop raises or floats? No, there's so many other things you can try to do. Just be cautious about not overdoing them because, as we said, there are some sort of, at the disclaimer, it's not generally not good to put too much money in out of position with weak hands. It's generally not good to try to attack people who have strong ranges. So you kind of need your opponents to have kind of the right set of circumstances to make these things a good idea. But I want you to think about them, all these different weird lines we talked about today, and sort of throw some questions or stuff into the chat below, and see if this makes any sense. Maybe this is just Andrew talking crazy for an hour, but hopefully you guys have enjoyed it. And I'm happy to sort of talk about it further. Anyway, that's going to do it for this episode. Hopefully you guys have had fun and have learned something, or at least had something to think about. But I'll be back soon with another video. But until then, this has been Andrew BalugaWhale Sideman, only here on DeucesCracked.com. I will see you guys next time. Good luck.